So I think you gave me a really good idea of the structure of a discussion. What about the following structure? We start talking about ethical reflection and Ayn Rand's ethics. Then we talk a bit about free will, which can be connected with ethics as being, for instance, a condition of moral responsibility according to many, many, many thinkers. Not everyone, but the majority of thinkers. And then talk a bit about the axioms that you said, because you said the axiom that Rand has, existence exists, and the nature of reason. What if we leave that towards the end?
Sure, that sounds good.
Right. Okay. So you mentioned the is-ought gap in David Hume. And I think that this is an excellent way to start a discussion about ethics. So to my mind, I think of ethical propositions and statements in terms of arguments. What do I mean by that? Because initially it sounds a bit counterintuitive, but when someone at the end says that we should perform a particular act, we should abstain from another act or kind of act, or that something is valuable or that it is not valuable, I try to think of whether they think that this is something that is to be accepted as self-evident, in which case there is no bridging the gap between an ought and an is. We still accept that there are values. Values may not be reducible to descriptive aspects of the world. Or we sort of think of the value or the normative property of an action as somehow being derived by other premises. Now, remember that Ayn Rand was really interested in the notion of an argument and the notion of a premise, and she was frequently telling people to check their premises. So my question is, when she starts by saying this or that is valuable, or when you say it, and when you say that we should or shouldn't perform a particular action, is that something that is accepted as self-evident by means of a sort of moral reflection or moral intuition? Or is it something that is derived by more self-evident propositions?
I think it's the latter. I wouldn't say it's self-evident that you should do such and such. For instance, that you should be honest. Yes. Or that you should live a productive life, creating values in some kind of career, whether as a doctor or a lawyer or an Uber driver or a dentist, as opposed to be a bum on the streets who lives off of handouts from other people or accepting welfare checks from the government. So I don't think it's self-evident. I think those sorts of ethical principles that differentiate people and that people have to choose among, those are things people have to think about and reason their way towards. It's not just obvious from the moment you're born as a child. You have to learn certain values and virtues that make your life a success, that make it go well. So I wouldn't say they're self-evident. They do have to be argued for. One of the ways to get to certain values and virtues is to recognize the long-run nature of life. We don't exist just on a moment-by-moment basis. What we do in the present has consequences for our future. So I can tell a lie now, and maybe that will give me some short-run benefits, but in the long run, it puts me into conflict with people. Now I might have to invent more lies to cover up the first lie, and I always have to be worried about who might find me out. So we live a long-range kind of existence, and in order to live the best sort of long-range life, we need to come up with certain principles. Among them, Rand would say, is honesty. She has 7 virtues that she identifies as part of her ethical system. The basic virtue would be rationality, using your mind to guide your life. But rationality has different aspects to it, one of which is being honest, others of which are having integrity, being independent, having a productive career, living a prideful life, where pride means being the best person that you can be. So there are many things that go into living a successful long-range life, but they do all have to be learned. I would not say they're self-evident.
Okay. And in that case, when you say this, I don't know whether this exactly bridges the gap between fact and value, or between, let's say, the descriptive and the normative, because it seems to me that to go from the consequences to what should be the case, we do need a sort of premise that these consequences are bad. Therefore, the acts that promote these consequences are bad. So it still seems to me that if we think of an argument with premises, an inference, and a conclusion, it seems to me that at the end of the day, there needs to be nothing new at the conclusion, because if there is, we are sort of arguing, we are basically not given an argument. We're having an arbitrary thought. So my question is whether you would say that Rand is committed to the idea that consequences generate rightness or wrongness, i.e., the wrongness of particular, the badness of particular consequences, for instance, with lying, generate a moral obligation to not lie. And whether for instance, the good consequences of integrity generate an obligation to have integrity. Would you say that this is the way she argues?
There are moral obligations, but they're all chosen fundamentally. So she thinks that morality rests on the choice to live fundamentally. So there is no duty or commandment like in the religious view where you just have a religious duty or a moral duty, thou shalt not lie.
Okay.
Regardless of the consequences. So you talk about consequences. She does take consequences into effect, the consequences on one's own life. So, for instance, with lying, if a murderer comes to your door and says, do you have any children, or a kidnapper, he wants to take your children, are you obligated to tell the kidnapper the truth and not lie? She would say no. Yeah. The purpose of morality is to achieve happiness and success in your own life, and that is not served if you tell the truth to a kidnapper. So you are, in fact, obligated to lie rather than not to lie in that case, because you would be serving your own interest by lying to the kidnapper. So she does definitely consider the consequences of actions and coming to a determination as to whether they are whether they are something you ought to do or ought not to do.
So would you say
yeah, go ahead.
That it's fair to draw a distinction between two levels of advice that Ayn Rand would give? One would be a more macro level, let's say, one more general, the other a bit more specific and would focus on consequences. Sorry, on particular circumstances. What do I mean by that? That in the beginning, when we talked about fact and value, it seems to me that the major argument that she would give, according to what you say, is I choose to live. Living and requires actions X, Y, and Z. Therefore, I should perform actions X, Y, and Z. Is this?
I think that at least approximates her view. I mean, she wouldn't say there's an obligation to choose to live. So we might call that the primary choice.
Okay.
And that's what gets morality going. It's sometimes called a pre-moral choice, the choice to live.
Yes.
Versus not live.
So would she say, sorry, I interrupted you. Sorry.
That's okay. I was just going to add, so once you do make that primary choice to live, then all the moral obligations that she argues for would apply, such as now you have an obligation to be honest and to be independent and productive and live a prideful life, understood in her sense of pride, making the best out of yourself. But prior to that primary choice to live, those moral obligations have no grip on you.
Okay. So are they sort of generated by choice?
In a way by choice, but also by the facts of reality. So human beings have a certain nature which requires them to live in a certain way if they're going to live at all, successfully, that is.
Yeah.
So in order to have a successful sort of life, she argues, you do need to adhere to such principles as honesty and being independent and being productive. So yeah, these these principles are downstream from the primary choice to live, but the primary choice to live itself cannot be. It's not itself a moral choice. Morality is downstream from that choice. I'm not sure that addressed your question. If you want to ask it again, that's fine.
No. So, judging from what I hear you saying, that she doesn't think that we have an obligation to survive, but if we choose to survive, we need to perform particular actions. So that seems to me in, let's say, Kantian language, that seems to me to be a form of instrumental imperative. There's no categorical...
Or hypothetical imperative.
Yes, a hypothetical imperative. So if you want
to survive,
live,
then you have to do such and such.
Then you have to do such and such. Okay, right. So let us try and talk a bit about the idea of self-interest. And I want to understand what it is that Ayn Rand says self-interest is, because correct me if I misrepresent her, but wouldn't she say that a person's self-interest is the ultimate goal of morality?
Yes. One's own happiness. It can be put in different ways. One's own life, one's own flourishing. I just want to add one point on the prior discussion. So I think she would say that the choice to live is primary, but it's not arbitrary. So many people might grant, okay, yeah, if you choose to live, then you have to do all these other things, be honest. I can accept that, at least for the sake of argument, one might say.
Yes.
But why? But it's the whole system is arbitrary. It rests on this primary choice to live. And why should I make that? I think that gets into a kind of technical, tricky issue, which there's been some debate about in the objectivist literature. And I could point people to some resources on that if they're interested. But I just want to flag that is a tricky choice, which requires some nuanced discussion. I don't know if we should get into that now, but I am aware of that issue, and it's an interesting and important one. But let me just throw it back to you. Okay. I didn't want to derail.
So no, but if you want to return a bit to this point, I'm thinking of moral, let's say, injunctions or moral commands. Yeah. You should do this, you should do the other, or this is valuable, the other is not. That's not a command, that's more of an evaluative judgment. It seems to me that either they're going to be self-evident or not. If they're self-evident, we sort of have a more like intuitionist position, like the one that Harold Pritchard was arguing for, or William David Ross in the early 20th century. And you could say that it represents a really strong tradition in ethical reflection throughout the centuries. If we are to say that these ethical commands are not self-evident, they need to be derived from somewhere. So it seems to me that their derivation, in order to not be arbitrary, it needs to be a very strict derivation. And the question is, especially when we talk about normative properties like the rightness or wrongness of an action, we need to understand exactly how this comes about. So unless rightness or wrongness of these actions feature somehow in the premises of the moral argument, the conclusion is going to be arbitrary. So it seems to me that if I were to be a, let's say, charitable interpreter of what Ayn Rand is putting forward, she would be giving a sort of derivation that would go like this. I choose to live. In order to live, I need to be a kind of person and perform particular actions. I need to perform these actions because they have these consequences, and consequences lead to my survival or constitute to in my survival. And consequences generate rightness. Therefore, it is right to be that kind of person, and it is right to perform these actions. Would you say that this is fair or not?
Maybe, depending on how that's interpreted. I'm taking some notes here. That's why I'm looking down sometimes. Okay. I take your point that you can't get something in the conclusion that doesn't somehow appear in the premises.
Yes.
And that reminded me of a point I wanted to make, which is that Ayn Rand's approach to ethics is inductive rather than deductive. It's not a syllogism. where you can just deduce some conclusion as to how you should act from something in the premises. It's a more kind of fact-based, observation-based approach. And now maybe that could later be formalized. At least elements of her inductive approach maybe could be transitioned or reformulated in a deductive kind of way. But primarily, I would say it's an inductive approach. So maybe to flesh out a bit more about what that means, she starts by looking out at reality and observing, and with the question in mind, what are values and where do they come from? Or our notion of good and bad, like where do these come from? They don't just come out of the blue. We get them from somewhere. And what sorts of things can things be good or bad for? And her answer to that is living things. Okay. So for instance, take a plant. Right here, so things can be good or bad for this plant. What would be good for it? Well, it gets sunlight, it gets water, it has nutriments from the soil. But when we're talking about the wall, well, what things are good or bad for the wall? Well, does that question really make sense? Are there any things that are good or bad for the wall? Now, we might say it's bad for the wall to be scratched. But yes, when we say that, what that means is it's bad for the owner of the wall. Like, I don't want my wall to look bad and all scratched up.
You could say the wall has no welfare. Yeah.
It has no interest. It has no welfare. The wall itself, not being a living thing that faces this alternative of life or death, there's nothing to further its interest or frustrate its interest. Inanimate things, the non-living, have no interest. There's nothing that can be good or bad to inanimate things in their own right, as distinct from someone who might own the inanimate things. But for living things, things can be good or bad, and the standard of that is the life. That's how we judge whether something is good or bad for this plant. So if it doesn't get water, if there's a drought, we say that's bad for the plants because it frustrates its ability to live. So I think there's not a very or maybe there's not as sharp a distinction between the descriptive and the normative as is often thought in contemporary philosophy, or maybe going back to Hume or further. But Ayn Rand finds values very intimately associated with life. And I tried to give some examples of where this idea of value comes from if we're just looking out of the world and being inductive rather than trying to deduce it from premises of an argument detached from observations about life and values and where they come from.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.